Lord works in mysterious ways, but I ain't never seen mystery like this. The mountain bobcat stood dead center of Route 220, tears streaming down her spotted face like she was mourning at a funeral. Not the kind of behavior you'd expect from a wild predator. Hell, not the kind of behavior you'd expect from any creature God put on this green earth. Hope Whitehawk eased her park ranger truck to a stop, hands gripping the wheel tighter than her grandmother's grip on Sunday prayers. In 28 years of living in these Virginia mountains, she'd seen plenty of wildlife do strange things. Bears raiding garbage cans, deer frozen in headlights, even a mountain lion that wandered into town looking lost as a tourist. But this was different. The bobcat's golden eyes locked onto hers through the windshield, and Hope felt her blood run cold. Around the animal's neck hung something that made her stomach drop, a small locket, tarnished and bloody. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Grace Morningstar should have known better than to answer her phone while driving through an October storm, but when Dr. Patterson's office called, you didn't let it go to voicemail. Not when you'd been waiting 3 weeks for test results that could change everything. "Mrs. Morningstar, we need you to come in immediately." The nurse's voice crackled through the speaker, barely audible over the rain hammering her windshield. "The doctor wants to discuss your results in person." Grace's hands trembled on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, 5-year-old Tommy was singing "Row, Row, Row Your Boat" in his sweet, off-key voice, completely oblivious to the fear creeping up his mother's spine like ice water. His stuffed wolf, the one he'd named Spirit after hearing his great-grandmother's Cherokee stories, sat buckled beside him in his booster seat. "Merrily, merrily, 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 life is but a dream," Tommy sang, his dark eyes sparkling with the kind of innocent joy that made Grace's heart ache. At 5, he still believed the world was good, still trusted that Mama could fix anything with a kiss and a Band-Aid. Grace forced herself to focus on the winding mountain road, but her mind kept spinning. The lumps she'd found, the fatigue that wouldn't go away, the way food had started tasting like cardboard. She'd told herself it was stress from being a single mother, from working double shifts at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center to make ends meet. "Mama, why are you crying?" Tommy's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Grace wiped her cheek, not realizing tears had started falling. "Mama's not crying, baby, just tired." "Row your boat gently down the stream," Tommy continued singing, and Grace found herself humming along despite everything. This was their song, the one she'd sung to him every night since he was born, the one her own grandmother had sung to her in both Cherokee and English, teaching her that life flows like a river, sometimes gentle, sometimes rough, but always moving forward. The call from the doctor's office had ended, but Grace's phone kept buzzing with texts. She glanced down for just a second, just 1 second, to see if it was important. That's when the deer leaped into the road. Grace yanked the wheel hard to the right, tires screaming against wet asphalt. The car spun once, twice, then slammed sideways into an old oak tree with a sound like thunder. The last thing she heard before everything went black was Tommy's voice, still singing softly in the sudden silence. "Merrily, merrily, 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 life is but a dream." When Grace woke up in the hospital 3 days later, the nurses told her she was lucky to be alive. They didn't tell her about Tommy until she asked. 6 months after the funeral, Grace Morningstar had built walls around her heart so high that even the angels couldn't climb them. She showed up to work at the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center every day at 7 sharp, did her job with quiet efficiency, and left without saying more than necessary to anyone. The other staff had learned not to assign her to the nursery ward anymore. Not after the incident with the orphaned fox kits that had left her locked in the supply closet, sobbing into boxes of medical gauze. "I don't do babies anymore," became Grace's standard response to any assignment involving young animals. Dr. Samuel Running Bear, the center's Cherokee director and the closest thing Grace had to family since her grandmother passed, respected her boundaries even when it broke his heart to watch her retreating further into herself each day. That's why he hesitated outside her office door on a cold March morning, holding a carrier that contained something he knew might either heal her or destroy what was left of her spirit entirely. "Grace, I need your help," he said, settling the carrier on her desk despite her immediate frown. "This little one is special." Through the mesh window, Grace could see a tiny bobcat kitten, maybe 8 weeks old, with oversized paws and the most striking golden eyes she'd ever seen on a wild animal. The kitten's spotted coat was perfectly groomed, unusual for an orphan, and there was something almost human in the way it tilted its head and watched her. "No," Grace said immediately, pushing the carrier toward Dr. Running Bear. "I told you, Sam. I don't do babies. Find someone else." "There is no one else. This kitten has already been rejected by 3 foster families. She won't eat for anyone, won't respond to standard rehabilitation protocols." Sam's weathered face creased with concern. "We found her 3 days ago next to her mother's body on Highway 58. Truck driver said she was sitting vigil, wouldn't leave even when they tried to scare her away." Grace kept her eyes fixed on her paperwork, but she could feel the kitten watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "That's what wild animals do when they're traumatized. She'll come around." "Grace," Sam's voice carried the weight of old wisdom and deeper understanding. "Look at her. Really look." Against her better judgment, Grace glanced up. The kitten had pressed its tiny paws against the mesh, and its head was tilted at an angle that sent ice shooting through Grace's veins. It was exactly the way Tommy used to cock his head when he was trying to figure something out, the same curious, intelligent expression that had made her heart melt 1,000 times. "No," she whispered, shoving her chair back so hard it hit the wall. "Absolutely not." But even as she spoke, the kitten made a soft chirping sound. Not quite a meow, not quite a purr. That sounded eerily like Tommy's laugh. Grace felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure in the wall she'd built around her heart. "Sam, take her away, please." Dr. Running Bear stood slowly, his joints creaking with age and arthritis. "You know what your grandmother would have said about this, Grace? About signs and spirits and the way the great Creator works through all his creatures? My grandmother believed in a lot of things that got her nowhere but dead and buried," Grace snapped, hating the bitterness in her own voice. "She believed that love doesn't die, it just changes form, that the spirits of those we've lost find ways to comfort us, to let us know they're still watching over us." Sam lifted the carrier but paused at the door. "This little one has been calling for 3 days straight. Same sound, over and over. Want to know what it sounds like?" Grace didn't answer, but Sam hummed anyway. A soft, off-key melody that made Grace's blood freeze in her veins. "Row, row, row your boat," the tune Tommy had been singing when he died. "That's coincidence," Grace said, but her voice came out weak and shaky. "Maybe. Or maybe your boy is trying to tell you something." Sam opened the door, then looked back. "I'll keep her 1 more night. After that, we'll have to put her down. She won't eat, Grace. She's dying of grief, just like you are." After Sam left, Grace sat in the silence of her office, staring at the empty space where the carrier had been. She tried to focus on her work, but her hands were shaking too badly to hold a pen. The sound the kitten had made kept echoing in her head, mixing with memories of Tommy's voice until she couldn't tell them apart. At 5 o'clock, she told herself she was just going to check on the animal before leaving. Professional curiosity, nothing more. She found the kitten in Isolation Ward 3, curled up in the corner of a sterile cage, refusing the bottle of Formula 1 of the volunteers was trying to offer. "She hasn't touched food or water since yesterday," the volunteer, a college kid named Beth, said sadly. "Dr. Running Bear thinks she might not make it through the night." Grace knelt beside the cage, studying the tiny creature that seemed too small and fragile to survive in a world that had already taken so much from her. The kitten's eyes opened at Grace's approach, and for a moment, Grace could have sworn she saw recognition there. Not the generic awareness of a wild animal, but something deeper, something that knew her. "Hey there, little girl," Grace whispered, surprised by the tenderness in her own voice. "What's your story?" The kitten struggled to its feet and moved toward the front of the cage, pressing its nose against the wire mesh. When Grace extended her finger, the kitten nuzzled it with desperate affection, purring so loudly it seemed impossible for such a small body to produce that much sound. Beth gasped. "She's never done that before, never responded to anyone." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. "What's her background? Where exactly did you find her?" "Highway 58, about a mile from Bent Creek. The mother was hit by a semi around midnight 3 days ago. Driver said he tried to move the kitten to safety, but she kept going back to the body." Beth checked her notes. Strange thing, though, the mother had obviously been nursing, but this was the only kitten anywhere around, like she was protecting just this one. Grace's breath caught. Bent Creek was less than 5 miles from the cemetery where Tommy was buried. She'd driven that stretch of Highway 58 countless times over the past 6 months, always taking the long way home to avoid passing the accident site where her life had ended along with her son's. "I want to take her home," Grace heard herself saying. Beth's eyes widened. "Doctor, Running Bear said you don't work with babies anymore." "I don't." Grace was already unlocking the cage door. "But this one is different." The kitten came to her without hesitation, climbing into her cupped hands and settling against her chest like she belonged there. Grace could feel the tiny heartbeat against her palm, rapid and strong and alive in a way that made her own heart remember how to beat properly. "What are you going to call her?" Beth asked. Grace looked down at the kitten, who was gazing up at her with those impossibly wise, golden eyes. In Cherokee tradition, naming was sacred. Names had power, connected the name to their purpose in the great web of life. Her grandmother had taught her that animals, like children, often revealed their names through their actions, their spirits calling out their true identity to those who knew how to listen. "Spirit," Grace said softly. "Her name is Spirit." The kitten purred louder, as if approving of the choice, and Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in 6 months, hope, fragile and terrifying, but real nonetheless. As she carried Spirit out to her truck, Grace whispered a prayer to her grandmother's memory and to whatever force had brought this tiny creature into her life. She didn't know if she believed in signs anymore, didn't know if the dead could really reach back through the veil to comfort the living. But she knew that for the first time since Tommy's death, she had a reason to come home to an empty house. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Patterson's office buzzed like angry wasps, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made Grace's already pale skin look corpse-like. She sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair, Spirit's carrier beside her feet, and tried to focus on the doctor's words instead of the way her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "I'm sorry, Grace. The cancer has spread faster than we anticipated. 6 months, maybe less." The words hit her like physical blows, each one driving the air from her lungs until she felt like she was drowning. 6 months. Tommy had been gone for a year, and now she had 6 months to figure out how to say goodbye to the only thing that had given her life meaning since his death. Spirit made a soft chirping sound from her carrier, as if sensing Grace's distress. Over the past year, the Bobcat had grown from a tiny kitten into a sleek, powerful adolescent, but she still sought Grace's comfort like a child seeking her mother. The irony wasn't lost on Grace. She'd failed to protect her human child, but somehow this wild creature trusted her completely. "What are my options?" Grace asked, though she already knew. She'd seen enough wildlife die at the rehabilitation center to recognize the hollow look in Dr. Patterson's eyes. "Chemotherapy might buy you some time, but the quality of life—" He trailed off, studying her chart. "Given the aggressive nature of this particular cancer and how far it's progressed, we're looking at months of being sick, weak, bedridden, and even then, there's no guarantee." Grace nodded slowly, her mind already moving past the medical prognosis to more practical concerns. Who would take care of Spirit? The Wildlife Center had strict policies about wild animals that had bonded too closely with humans. They were typically euthanized rather than released, considered too dangerous to rehabilitate and too habituated to survive in the wild. "I need some time to think," she said. Dr. Patterson's expression softened. "Grace, I know you've been through hell this past year. If you want to talk to someone, a counselor or—" "I'm fine." The lie came automatically. Grace had become an expert at fine. Fine when people asked how she was coping, fine when they suggested she needed to move on, fine when they looked at her with pity and whispered about the poor woman who'd lost her child. "I just need to get my affairs in order." The drive home was a blur of autumn colors and winding mountain roads. Spirit rode silently in her carrier, occasionally making soft sounds that Grace had learned to interpret over the months they'd been together. This sound was worry. Spirit could sense emotional distress better than most humans, and Grace's had been radiating grief and fear since they'd left the doctor's office. Back at her small cabin on the edge of the national forest, Grace let Spirit out into the large enclosed yard she'd built specifically for the Bobcat. Watching Spirit explore and hunt and simply exist brought Grace more peace than any therapy session ever could. This wild, beautiful creature had saved her from drowning in grief, had given her a reason to get up every morning when the weight of losing Tommy made it feel impossible to breathe. Now she was going to have to leave Spirit behind too. Grace settled into the old rocking chair on her porch. The same chair where her grandmother had told her Cherokee stories about shapeshifters and spirit animals, about the connection between all living things in the sacred web of existence. Spirit approached cautiously, as she always did when Grace was upset, and laid her head on Grace's lap. "What am I going to do with you, baby?" Grace whispered, stroking the bobcat's soft fur. Spirit purred, a sound that vibrated through Grace's bones and reminded her so much of Tommy's contented sighs when she used to rock him to sleep. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Tommy, at 2 years old, curled against her chest in this same chair, his small hand fisted in her shirt as she sang "Row, row, row your boat" in the soft Cherokee lullaby her grandmother had taught her. He'd been so small, so trusting, so certain that his mama could protect him from anything the world might throw at him. I failed him, Grace thought, the familiar guilt clawing at her chest. I was supposed to keep him safe, and I failed. Spirit seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts. The bobcat lifted her head and made a sound Grace had never heard before. A low, mournful cry that sounded almost like human weeping. It was the sound of loss, of grief so deep it had no words. "You understand, don't you?" Grace said softly. "You lost your mama, too." As if in response, Spirit went to the corner of the porch where Grace kept Tommy's stuffed wolf, the toy that had somehow survived the accident, and that Spirit had claimed as her own from the first night she'd come home. The bobcat carried the worn toy back to Grace and placed it carefully in her lap, then settled beside the chair with her chin resting on Grace's foot. The gesture broke something open in Grace's chest. For over a year she'd been carrying the weight of survivor's guilt, the crushing knowledge that she'd lived when her innocent child had died. She'd thrown herself into caring for Spirit partly as penance, partly as purpose, but mostly because the bobcat's obvious grief mirrored her own. Now, facing her own mortality, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced since the accident. Clarity, not peace, not acceptance, but a clear understanding of what she needed to do with whatever time she had left. Spirit couldn't survive in captivity after Grace died. She was too bonded, too humanized to be placed with another handler. But she also couldn't simply be released into the wild, not after more than a year of domestic living, not without the survival skills she would have learned from her mother. Grace would have to teach her. In the time she had left, she would need to gradually wild Spirit, to break the bonds between them so the bobcat could survive on her own. It would be the hardest thing she'd ever done, harder even than burying her child, but it was the only gift she could give. Over the following weeks, Grace began Spirit's rewilding education in secret. She started taking the bobcat on longer hiking trips, teaching her to hunt live prey instead of relying on the food Grace provided. She gradually reduced the amount of human contact, forcing Spirit to spend more time alone, to remember her wild instincts. It was heartbreaking work. Spirit clearly didn't understand why Grace was pulling away, why the woman who had been her whole world was suddenly distant and unavailable. The bobcat would pace the fence line of her enclosure, calling for Grace with sounds that grew increasingly desperate and confused. "Animals carry the spirits of those we've lost," her grandmother's voice whispered in Grace's memory. "Sometimes the Great Spirit sends them to teach us about love, about letting go, about the courage it takes to say goodbye." Grace had always believed Spirit carried something of Tommy's spirit, the same curious intelligence, the same capacity for joy, the same absolute trust that love would keep them safe. Now she wondered if Spirit had come to teach her something else entirely, how to love something enough to let it go. The nights were the hardest. Spirit would position herself outside Grace's bedroom window, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky, watching and waiting for the connection they'd once shared. Grace would lie in bed, fighting the urge to go outside and comfort the confused animal, reminding herself that this separation was necessary. Spirit needed to learn to be independent, to trust her own instincts instead of relying on human guidance. But sometimes, when the mountain wind carried Spirit's lonely calls through the darkness, Grace would remember Tommy's voice singing their song, and she would wonder if she was making the right choice or simply repeating the same pattern of loss that had defined her entire life. "Merrily, merrily, 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 life is but a dream," she would whisper into her pillow, and somewhere in the night, Spirit would answer with a sound that was part purr, part sob, part prayer to whatever force had brought them together in the first place. Hope Whitehawk had seen plenty of abandoned campsites in her 8 years as a park ranger, but nothing quite like this. The tent was still standing, guy lines taut and rainfly properly secured, as if someone had stepped away for a moment and planned to return. But the camp stove was cold, the fire ring held only wet ash, and there was an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of Hope's neck stand up. Spirit paced anxiously at the edge of the clearing, making soft, whimpering sounds that seemed almost human in their distress. The bobcat had led Hope nearly 2 miles through dense forest to reach this spot, following what appeared to be an old game trail that most hikers would never find. "Easy, girl," Hope murmured, though she felt anything but easy herself. Something about this place felt wrong, charged with the kind of energy that came before storms or earthquakes, nature holding its breath before something terrible happened. The tent flap was partially unzipped, and Hope could see personal belongings scattered inside, a sleeping bag, camping gear, and something that made her stomach clench. Dozens of photographs taped to the tent walls. Even from outside, she could see they were all of the same subject. A young boy with dark hair and bright eyes, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Hope's radio crackled to life. "Unit 247, what's your status?" I've located what appears to be an abandoned campsite. Single tent, recent occupation, but no sign of the camper. Hope kept her voice steady, despite the growing unease in her chest. I'm going to investigate further. Copy that. Be advised we've had no permit applications for that sector this week. No permits meant whoever had been camping here was either lost or deliberately hiding. Hope unholstered her flashlight and approached the tent cautiously, Spirit following close behind with obvious reluctance. Inside the tent, Hope's worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't just an abandoned campsite, it was a shrine. The photographs covering every surface showed the same dark-haired boy in various stages of childhood, from baby pictures to what looked like recent school photos. In the center of the display sat a small stuffed wolf, worn smooth from handling, and beside it lay an open journal filled with handwriting in black ink. Hope picked up the journal with trembling hands and read the first entry. Day 1. I brought Spirit to Tommy's favorite place. She doesn't understand yet, but she will. I'm going to teach her to be wild again, the way Tommy would have wanted. The way she was meant to be before I made her into something she was never supposed to become. The entries continued, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Day 3. Spirit won't eat the rabbit she caught. She keeps bringing it to me like an offering. I have to stop accepting them. I have to stop being her mother. Day 5. Found Tommy's old hiking boots in the closet today, size 10 toddler. Spirit sniffed them and made that sound she makes when she misses someone. I think she remembers him somehow. I think she knows. Day 8. Dr. Patterson called. The cancer is moving faster than expected. Maybe weeks now instead of months. I need to hurry. Spirit needs to be ready. Hope's hands were shaking as she flipped through more pages, each entry revealing another piece of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly clear and increasingly tragic. Grace Morningstar wasn't just a camper who'd gotten lost. She was a dying woman trying to prepare her beloved Bobcat for a life without her. But the final entries made Hope's blood run cold. Day 12. I can't do this anymore. Every time I push Spirit away, I see Tommy's face when I told him I was too busy to read him a story. Every time she cries for me, I hear him calling for Mama in the hospital before he died. I failed my son. I won't fail her. Day 13. New plan. I'll take Spirit deep into the wilderness, to the place where Tommy and I used to hike. I'll set up camp and wait. When the cancer takes me, Spirit will have to learn to survive on her own. Natural selection, the way it was supposed to be. Last entry. If someone finds this journal, please know that I'm not giving up. I'm giving Spirit the only gift I have left to give, freedom. And I'm giving myself the only peace I can find. Tommy is calling me home. Hope dropped the journal as if it had burned her. This wasn't just an abandoned campsite, it was a suicide mission. Grace Morningstar had brought Spirit into the mountains to die, believing that forcing the Bobcat to watch her human caretaker waste away would somehow prepare the animal for independence. Jesus, Hope whispered, her grandmother's Cherokee blood recognizing the profound spiritual sickness in such a plan. To die in despair, surrounded by grief and guilt, would poison the very ground where it happened. Her grandmother had taught her that death should come with peace, with blessing, with the community of loved ones to sing the spirit home. Spirit suddenly went rigid, her ears pricked forward and her tail switching with agitation. She made a sound Hope had never heard from a bobcat, a low, mournful howl that seemed to carry all the grief in the world. The sound was coming from deeper in the forest, and Spirit was looking in that direction with obvious recognition and fear. Hope's radio crackled again. Unit 247, we've got a report of someone requesting medical evacuation from your sector. Female voice, sounded distressed. Can you confirm? Negative, I don't see anyone. Hope replied, but even as she spoke she could hear something in the distance, a faint voice calling for help, barely audible over the wind in the trees. Hope gathered the most important items from the tent: the journal, a photograph of the boy who must be Tommy, and a small bag that turned out to contain prescription medications. The bottles were labeled for Grace Morning Star, and the medications told a story of advanced cancer, pain management, anti-nausea drugs, and something called morphine sulfate that made Hope's heart race. "Come on, girl," she said to Spirit. "Take me to her." The Bobcat led Hope off the trail and down a steep slope toward the sound of running water. The terrain was treacherous, all loose rocks and hidden roots, the kind of country that could kill you if you weren't careful. Hope understood now why Grace had chosen this place. It was remote enough that a body might not be found for months, isolated enough that Spirit would have no choice but to rely on her wild instincts to survive. But as they got closer to the water, Hope realized Grace's plan had gone horribly wrong. The voice calling for help was getting weaker, more desperate, and Spirit's agitation was increasing with every step. This wasn't a peaceful death surrounded by nature's beauty. This was a woman in serious trouble, possibly dying in pain and terror while her beloved animal companion watched helplessly. The sound of Spirit's distressed calling earlier suddenly made sense. The Bobcat hadn't been mourning. She'd been trying to get help for Grace, using the only method she knew, finding humans and leading them back to the source of the problem. Hope's radio crackled with static, and she realized they were getting close to the edge of the park's communication range. If Grace needed medical evacuation, Hope would have to get back to higher ground to coordinate it, which meant leaving Spirit and Grace alone again. But first, she had to find them. The voice was definitely coming from the direction of the creek now, and Hope could make out words. "Help, please, can't move." Spirit bounded ahead, disappearing into a grove of pine trees, and Hope followed as quickly as she dared. The forest was eerily quiet except for the sound of running water and that faint, desperate voice calling for help. When Hope finally caught up with Spirit, she found the Bobcat sitting at the edge of a small ravine, looking down with obvious distress. Following the animal's gaze, Hope saw a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A woman trapped beneath a fallen log at the bottom of the ravine, her face pale with pain and exhaustion, one hand reaching weakly toward the Bobcat above. "Grace?" Hope called down. The woman's head turned toward the sound, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah's sister?" Hope's world tilted sideways. Sarah? Her sister Sarah, dead 3 years now in a car accident not 20 miles from where they stood. Hope had never mentioned Sarah to anyone in the Park Service, had never talked about the sister who'd shared her love of animals in wild places. "How do you know about Sarah?" Hope called down, already moving to find a way into the ravine. Grace's answer came back weak but clear. "She talked about you all the time." Hope who became a ranger, Hope who could talk to animals. And suddenly, Hope understood. This wasn't a coincidence. Grace Morning Star knowing about Sarah, Spirit leading Hope specifically to this campsite, the timing of everything. It was all connected in ways that made her Cherokee grandmother's stories about fate and destiny seem less like folklore and more like truth. Spirit hadn't just been looking for any human to help Grace. She'd been looking for hope. The storm hit Bent Creek without warning, just as Grace Morning Star had finished setting up camp in Tommy's favorite meadow. One moment she was arranging his stuffed wolf carefully inside the tent. The next, she was scrambling to secure guy lines against winds that seemed determined to tear her shelter apart. Spirit pressed close to her legs, the Bobcat's wild instincts sensing the danger in the rapidly darkening sky long before Grace's human senses caught up. Lightning split the evening air with a crack that seemed to shake the very mountains, followed immediately by thunder so loud it made Grace's ears ring. Spirit bolted, her spotted form disappearing into the tree line faster than Grace's eyes could follow. It was natural behavior. Wild animals fled from electrical storms, seeking shelter in caves or dense undergrowth where they'd be safe from strikes. "Spirit!" Grace called after her, but her voice was swallowed by another crash of thunder. She knew better than to chase a frightened bobcat into the wilderness during a storm. Spirit would return when the weather passed, drawn back by the scent of camp and the sound of Grace's voice. But as Grace turned to secure the last of her camping gear, she heard something that made her blood freeze, the groaning, splintering sound of wood under stress. The massive pine tree that had sheltered this meadow for decades, weakened by the same lightning that had sent Spirit running, swayed dangerously in the violent wind. Grace had perhaps 3 seconds to react. She could have run toward the tent, could have fled toward the creek, could have thrown herself flat and hoped the tree would miss her entirely. Instead, some instinct she couldn't name sent her running after Spirit, toward the spot where her beloved bobcat had disappeared into the forest. She made it perhaps 20 feet before the tree came down. The impact was devastating. Grace felt herself thrown forward by the shock wave, her body tumbling down a slope she hadn't even realized was there in the darkness. She landed hard at the bottom of what turned out to be a shallow ravine, her right leg trapped beneath a section of the fallen trunk that had broken off during the fall. Pain exploded through her consciousness, white-hot and all-consuming. She tried to move, tried to pull her leg free, but the weight was impossible to shift. Worse, she could feel something warm and wet spreading beneath her, blood from internal injuries she couldn't see but knew were serious. "Help!" she screamed into the storm, though she knew no one could hear her. The nearest hiking trail was miles away, and she'd deliberately chosen this remote spot specifically because it was far from any human contact. Spirit appeared at the edge of the ravine within minutes, her spotted coat soaked from the rain, amber eyes wide with distress. The bobcat paced back and forth along the rim, making sounds Grace had never heard before. A combination of purring, chirping, and what almost sounded like human crying. "I'm okay, baby," Grace lied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the agony radiating from her trapped leg. "I'm okay. You need to go find shelter. Find somewhere safe to wait out the storm." But Spirit didn't leave. Instead, she found a path down into the ravine, picking her way carefully over wet rocks and fallen branches until she reached Grace's side. The bobcat immediately began nuzzling Grace's face and hands, her purring so loud it was audible even over the continuing storm. As the hours passed and the rain soaked through Grace's clothing, she began to understand the gravity of her situation. Her leg was definitely broken. She could see the unnatural angle even in the dim light filtering down through the storm clouds. More concerning was the spreading numbness in her other leg and the increasing difficulty she was having staying conscious. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come here planning to die peacefully while teaching Spirit to be wild again. Instead, she was dying violently while Spirit refused to leave her side, the very scenario she'd been trying to avoid. "Listen to me," she whispered to Spirit as dawn began to break through the dissipating storm clouds. "You need to go back to the road. Remember what we practiced? Find the road people. Find someone who can help." Spirit's response was to curl up tighter against Grace's body, sharing what warmth she could with her dying human. The devotion was heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. Grace's vision was starting to blur from blood loss and shock, but she forced herself to focus on Spirit's collar. With trembling fingers, she managed to detach her emergency location tag, the one she'd worn ever since starting her cancer treatments, programmed with her medical information and next-of-kin contact. She'd brought it specifically for this purpose. though she'd imagined attaching it to Spirit's collar under very different circumstances. "You have to go," she said, her voice barely audible now. "You have to find someone. This little tag will tell them who I am, and they'll know to take care of you." Spirit seemed to understand the importance of what Grace was doing. She sat still while Grace attached the tag to her collar, right next to Tommy's wolf charm. Then she looked at Grace with those impossibly intelligent amber eyes, as if asking for final confirmation. "Go find help, baby," Grace whispered. "Go find the road people, just like we practiced. And remember, you're wild. You're beautiful and wild and free. Don't let them put you in a cage." For a moment, Spirit didn't move. Then she leaned forward and nuzzled Grace's cheek one last time, a gesture so tender and human-like that Grace felt her heart breaking all over again. The bobcat stood, looked back once, and then began the treacherous climb out of the ravine. Grace watched until Spirit's spotted form disappeared over the rim, then closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. She'd failed Tommy by letting him die in that car accident. She'd failed Spirit by bringing her to this remote place to die. But maybe, just maybe, Spirit could succeed where Grace had failed. Maybe the bobcat's wild intelligence and the bond they'd forged could accomplish what Grace's human planning couldn't. The sun was fully up now, warming the ravine and drying Grace's soaked clothing. She could hear birds singing in the distance, completely oblivious to the human drama playing out in their forest. Somewhere above her, Spirit was making her way back toward the road, carrying Grace's emergency tag and all of Grace's remaining hopes. Grace had always imagined death would come with Tommy's voice singing their song, with memories of happier times and the promise of reunion in whatever came after. Instead, it was coming with the sound of running water and bird songs, with the scent of pine and wildflowers, and with the knowledge that she'd given Spirit the best chance she could for survival. It wasn't the ending she'd planned, but it was the ending she'd earned. And as consciousness began to slip away, Grace found herself humming softly. "Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream." Somewhere in the distance she thought she could hear Spirit calling back, not with the desperate cries of a confused animal, but with the determined vocalizations of a creature on a mission. Grace smiled despite the pain. Her girl knew what to do. Now it was just a matter of whether Spirit could find someone in time, and whether that someone would understand what a bobcat wearing an emergency tag was trying to tell them. Grace had done everything she could. The rest was up to Spirit and whatever force had brought them together in the first place. As the sun climbed higher and the forest around her came fully alive with the sounds of a new day, Grace Morningstar closed her eyes and waited to see if love and trust and the bond between human and animal would be enough to save them both. 3 days before the camping trip that would change everything, Grace Morningstar stood in the doorway of Tommy's bedroom for the last time, her trembling hand resting on the doorknob she hadn't turned in over a year. The room looked exactly as it had the morning he died. Dinosaur sheets still rumpled from his last sleep, toy trucks scattered across the carpet where he'd left them, his favorite books stacked beside the bed waiting for a bedtime story that would never come. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment Grace could almost see him there, her dark-haired boy with his gap-toothed grin and endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether animals had dreams. She'd promised him so many things in those final weeks before the accident. Promised they'd go camping at his favorite spot by Bent Creek. Promised they'd teach Spirit to fish. Promised they'd always be together. "I break all my promises," Grace thought, her chest tightening with familiar guilt. "To him, to Spirit, to everyone who ever believed in me." Spirit appeared beside her in the hallway, as if sensing Grace's emotional distress. Over the past year, the Bobcat had developed an uncanny ability to read Grace's moods, appearing whenever the grief threatened to pull her under completely. Now, Spirit butted her head against Grace's leg and made that soft, purring sound that had become Grace's only comfort in the darkest hours. "We're going to see Tommy today, baby," Grace whispered, reaching down to stroke Spirit's spotted fur. "We're going to his favorite place, where he used to collect rocks and chase butterflies. Would you like that?" Spirit's response was a series of soft chirps that Grace had learned to interpret over their months together. The Bobcat had her own language of sounds, different calls for hunger, for play, for contentment, and for the deep loneliness that seemed to echo Grace's own. This sound was curiosity mixed with concern, as if Spirit could sense the finality in Grace's voice. Grace forced herself to step into Tommy's room, her bare feet sinking into the soft carpet where she'd spent countless hours playing with trucks and reading stories. She went to his dresser and picked up the framed photograph that had become her most treasured possession. Tommy, at 4 years old, grinning at the camera while holding a baby rabbit they'd found in the backyard. His eyes sparkled with the kind of pure joy that only children possessed, the unshakable belief that the world was good and Mama could fix anything. "I'm sorry, baby boy," she whispered to the photograph. "Mama tried to stay strong for you, but I'm so tired." "I'm so tired of pretending to be okay when everything hurts." From the dresser drawer, she pulled out Tommy's most beloved possession, the stuffed wolf their Cherokee great-grandmother had given him for his 3rd birthday. The toy was worn smooth from countless nights of cuddling, its fur faded from brown to gray, one ear slightly chewed from teething. Tommy had named it Spirit Wolf, after the Cherokee stories about guardian spirits that watched over children. Spirit the Bobcat approached the stuffed animal with reverence, as she always did. From the first night Grace had brought her home, Spirit had claimed the toy as her own, carrying it around the house and sleeping curled around it like a living kitten. Grace had initially been disturbed by this behavior, but her grief counselor had suggested it might be healthy for both of them. The Bobcat finding comfort in something that carried Tommy's scent, Grace finding peace in knowing her son's favorite toy was still bringing comfort to someone. "You understand, don't you?" Grace said to Spirit, who was now gently nuzzling the stuffed wolf. "You know he's gone, but you remember him. You remember how much he loved you, even when you were just a wild kitten we'd see in the woods." The plan had taken weeks to formulate, growing in Grace's mind like a cancer of its own. She couldn't bear the thought of dying slowly in a hospital bed, wasting away while Spirit watched from behind the glass walls of the Wildlife Center. She couldn't stand the idea of leaving Spirit to be euthanized because no one else would take responsibility for a bobcat too humanized to survive in the wild. But if they went to Tommy's place, to the hidden meadow by Bent Creek where he'd spent his happiest hours, then maybe Grace could find a way to die with dignity while teaching Spirit to be wild again. Maybe the bobcat would learn to hunt and fend for herself out of necessity. Maybe Grace could finally keep one promise, the promise to make sure Spirit would be okay after she was gone. "It's not suicide," Grace told herself as she packed camping gear with methodical precision. "It's just letting nature take its course. I'm dying anyway. At least this way, I can die somewhere beautiful, somewhere that holds good memories." She packed light, just the essentials for a few days in the wilderness, plus Tommy's stuffed wolf and the bottle of morphine pills Dr. Patterson had prescribed for the pain. When the cancer took her, the morphine would make sure it happened peacefully, quietly, without the thrashing and gasping that had haunted her nightmares since watching her grandmother die. His Spirit followed her around the house as Grace completed her preparations, the bobcat's behavior increasingly agitated. Wild animals possessed instincts humans had lost, and Spirit clearly sensed that something was wrong, that this wasn't an ordinary camping trip. She vocalized more than usual, a series of worried chirps and calls that sounded almost like protests. "I know you don't understand," Grace said, loading the last of their supplies into her truck, "but this is the only way I can protect you. If I die in a hospital, they'll put you down within a week. At least this way, you'll have a chance." The drive to Bent Creek took 40 minutes on winding mountain roads that Grace knew by heart. She'd driven this route countless times with Tommy strapped into his car seat, singing songs and pointing out deer and hawks through the windows. Now Spirit rode in the passenger seat, secured in the custom harness Grace had bought when the Bobcat outgrew her travel carrier. Tommy's meadow was exactly as Grace remembered it, a hidden clearing surrounded by towering pines with a small creek running along one edge and a natural clearing perfect for camping. Tommy had discovered it during one of their hiking adventures when he was 3, declaring it the most beautiful place in the whole world, with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. Grace set up camp methodically, her hands shaking from medication and emotion. She pitched the tent in the exact spot where she and Tommy had camped 2 summers ago, when he'd insisted on sleeping outside to protect Mama from bears. She built a fire ring using the same stones Tommy had carefully selected and arranged. She even hung their camp lantern from the same low branch where Tommy had hung his jacket. Spirit explored the meadow with obvious delight, her wild instincts recognizing this as prime Bobcat territory. There were plenty of small game trails, evidence of rabbits and squirrels, and the creek provided fresh water. If Grace's plan worked, Spirit would gradually learn to hunt and fend for herself as Grace grew weaker and less able to provide care. But as the sun began to set on their first day, Grace found herself questioning everything. Spirit kept returning to the campsite, bringing Grace small offerings, a pretty stone, a bird feather, a fresh-killed mouse that she placed carefully at Grace's feet like gifts. The Bobcat's devotion was absolute, her love unconditional, and Grace realized with growing horror that Spirit would never willingly leave her alone to die. "What am I doing?" Grace thought as Spirit curled up beside her sleeping bag, purring contentedly. "I'm planning to make her watch me die, just like I made Tommy ride in the car that night. I'm going to traumatize her the same way I traumatized my son." That night, Grace lay awake, listening to Spirit's steady breathing and the gentle sounds of the creek, and she understood that her plan was fundamentally flawed. She wasn't preparing Spirit for independence. She was preparing to break the Bobcat's heart the same way her own had been broken. She was choosing to die in despair and guilt, surrounded by the very love she felt unworthy of receiving. But it was too late to turn back now. The cancer was moving faster than expected, the pain increasing daily despite the medications. Grace had maybe days left, possibly less, and they were too far from civilization for her to survive the hike back to the truck. "I'm sorry, Spirit," she thought, watching the Bobcat sleep peacefully beside Tommy's stuffed wolf. "I'm sorry I'm not strong enough to do this right. I'm sorry I'm going to leave you alone just like I left him." Outside the tent, an owl called through the darkness, and Grace remembered her grandmother's teaching that owls were messengers between the world of the living and the spirit realm. Maybe Tommy was trying to tell her something. Maybe there was still time to make a different choice. But as sleep finally claimed her, Grace's last conscious thought was that some mistakes couldn't be undone, and some promises couldn't be kept, no matter how much love remained in a broken heart. The descent into the ravine was treacherous, all loose rocks and hidden roots that could send hope tumbling to the bottom with one careless step. She moved with the careful precision that 8 years of mountain rescue training had drilled into her, testing each foothold before committing her full weight, keeping her center of gravity low as she worked her way down the steep slope toward the motionless figure at the bottom. Spirit bounded ahead with the natural agility of her species, but even the bobcat moved carefully, occasionally looking back to ensure Hope was following safely. The urgency in Spirit's movements was palpable. This wasn't a leisurely descent, but a desperate race against time. When Hope finally reached the bottom of the ravine, the sight that greeted her was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Grace Morning Star lay pinned beneath a massive section of fallen pine trunk, her face pale as parchment, her breathing so shallow it was barely visible. Blood had soaked into the ground beneath her, dark and ominous in the filtered sunlight that reached the ravine floor. "Grace?" Hope called softly, dropping to her knees beside the trapped woman. "Grace, can you hear me?" Grace's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with pain and fever. When she tried to speak, her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Sarah's sister?" The words hit Hope like a physical blow. Sarah. Her sister Sarah, dead 3 years now in a car accident that had shattered Hope's world almost as completely as Tommy's death had shattered Grace's. How could this dying woman possibly know about Sarah? "How do you know my sister?" Hope asked, her hands already moving to assess Grace's injuries while her mind reeled with the impossibility of the connection. "She talked about you all the time," Grace managed, her hazel eyes struggling to focus on Hope's face. "Hope who became a ranger. Hope who could talk to animals like grandmother taught her." The Cherokee reference sent chills down Hope's spine. Sarah had indeed talked about their grandmother's teachings, about the old ways of understanding the language that existed between humans and the natural world. But how could Grace possibly know these intimate family details? "You knew Sarah?" Hope's voice cracked with emotion as she radioed for immediate medical evacuation, her professional training warring with the personal revelation that was turning her world upside down. "Wildlife Center. Volunteer program," Grace whispered, each word clearly costing her enormous effort. "She always said, you two would like each other. Same stubborn streak. Same soft heart for broken things." Hope felt tears burning behind her eyes as she worked to stabilize Grace's condition. The coincidence was impossible, too perfect to be random chance. But here was Grace, dying in a remote ravine with only a bobcat for company, and somehow she knew intimate details about Hope's family that could only have come from Sarah herself. Spirit had positioned herself protectively beside Grace, occasionally nuzzling the woman's face with obvious distress. The bond between human and animal was unlike anything Hope had ever witnessed, deeper than the usual relationship between wildlife rehabilitator and rescued animal, more like the connection between family members. "Grace, I need you to stay with me," Hope said, checking Grace's pulse and finding it weak and thready. "The helicopter is coming, but you need to fight. You need to hold on." "No," Grace said with surprising firmness. "Not hospital. Let me die here, with the mountains and my babies." The moral dilemma hit Hope instantly. As a park ranger, she was sworn to preserve life. But as someone who understood Cherokee traditions about death and dying, she also knew that forcing medical intervention on someone who wanted to die naturally could be seen as a violation of their spiritual beliefs. "Grace, you don't understand. You could survive this. With proper medical care." "I have cancer," Grace interrupted, her voice gaining strength from some deep reserve of determination. "Stage 4, maybe weeks left anyway. I came here to teach Spirit to be wild again, before I died. The revelation explained so much. Grace's frail appearance, the carefully planned camping trip, Spirit's obvious distress and confusion about her human's behavior. This hadn't been a hiking accident at all. It had been a pilgrimage, a journey to a sacred place where Grace had hoped to die with dignity while preparing Spirit for independence. "That's why you orchestrated all of this," Hope said, understanding flooding through her. "You researched me after Sarah died. You knew I was a park ranger in this area. You trained Spirit to find roads when she was in distress. You wanted her to find me specifically." Grace's smile was weak but unmistakable. "Sarah always said you were the one who understood animals best. I needed someone who would see Spirit as more than just a wild animal to be put down." The helicopter's rotors were audible in the distance now, growing louder as the medical team approached. Hope faced a choice that would define not just Grace's fate, but Spirit's future and her own understanding of what family truly meant. "If I let them take you to the hospital, what happens to Spirit?" Hope asked. "Wildlife Center will euthanize her. Too bonded to humans, can't be released. Too dangerous for permanent captivity." Grace's eyes pleaded with Hope to understand. "I thought if she found you, maybe you could—" "I'll take her," Hope said without hesitation. "I'll take responsibility for Spirit. But only if you let them try to save you. Sarah would never forgive me if I let her friend die when there was a chance to save her." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her breathing labored as she considered Hope's offer. Spirit seemed to sense the importance of the conversation, positioning herself so she could touch both women simultaneously, as if trying to forge a physical connection between them. "You would really take her, even knowing how difficult it would be?" "I know what it's like to lose family," Hope said, thinking of Sarah's death and the years of grief that had followed. "I know what it's like to feel responsible for someone's death. Don't make me feel responsible for yours too." The helicopter was directly overhead now, the downdraft from its rotors stirring up debris and making conversation nearly impossible. Hope could see the rescue team preparing to lower a basket and medical personnel to the ravine floor. "Promise me," Grace said, gripping Hope's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me that if the medical treatment doesn't work, if the cancer takes me anyway, you'll make sure Spirit has a good life, not just survival, but purpose, meaning." "I promise," Hope said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The medical team reached them within minutes, professional and efficient as they worked to stabilize Grace for transport. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s with the calm competence that came from years of mountain rescues, quickly assessed the situation. "Compound fracture of the right tibia, possible internal bleeding, signs of dehydration and shock," she reported to the helicopter crew. "We need to move fast." As they worked to free Grace's leg from beneath the fallen tree, Spirit became increasingly agitated. The Bobcat clearly understood that her human was being taken away, and she began making the same desperate vocalizations that had first brought Hope to this spot. "It's okay, girl," Hope said, positioning herself where Spirit could see her clearly. "I'm going to take care of you. Grace asked me to, and I gave her my word." Whether Spirit truly understood the words or simply responded to Hope's calm tone, the Bobcat settled slightly, though she remained vigilant as the medical team worked. The extraction took nearly an hour, complicated by the remote location and the delicate nature of Grace's injuries. Throughout the process, Grace drifted in and out of consciousness. But whenever she was awake, her eyes sought out Spirit and Hope, as if needing to confirm that the connection she'd worked so hard to create was holding firm. Finally, Grace was secured in the rescue basket and being lifted toward the waiting helicopter. As she rose above the ravine, she called down weakly, "Tell her, tell Spirit that Tommy says he's proud of her." Hope felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the helicopter disappear over the mountain peaks. Beside her, Spirit sat quietly, her amber eyes following the aircraft until it was completely out of sight. Then the Bobcat turned to Hope with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity: grief, uncertainty, but also a tentative trust. "Well, girl," Hope said, settling cross-legged on the ground so she was at Spirit's eye level. "Looks like it's just you and me now. Your mama asked me to take care of you, and I don't break promises to family." Spirit approached slowly, cautiously, until she was close enough for Hope to touch. When Hope extended her hand, the Bobcat sniffed it carefully, then butted her head against Hope's palm in what could only be described as acceptance. In that moment, Hope understood that her life had just changed forever. She was no longer just a park ranger protecting wilderness areas. She was now the guardian of a remarkable animal who represented the bridge between human and wild, the living embodiment of love that transcended species boundaries. As they began the long hike back to Hope's truck, Spirit staying close but alert to every sight and sound around them, Hope found herself thinking about family and fate, and the mysterious ways that love finds us when we need it most. Sarah would have understood this, would have seen the poetry in a bobcat bringing two grieving souls together across the divide of loss. The road ahead would be complicated. There would be permits to obtain, living arrangements to modify, and the daily challenge of caring for a wild animal who had chosen to live between two worlds. But Hope had made a promise, and Cherokee women didn't break their word. Behind them, the ravine where Grace had nearly died grew smaller and more distant. Ahead lay an uncertain but hopeful future where healing might be possible for all of them, human and animal alike. 3 months after the helicopter lifted Grace Morning Star from the ravine that should have been her grave, Hope Whitehawk sat on her front porch watching the most unlikely family she'd ever seen. Grace was settled in the rocking chair that had belonged to Hope's Cherokee grandmother, her thin frame wrapped in one of Hope's hand-knitted afghans, while Spirit dozed contentedly at her feet. The morphine drip had been replaced with better pain management, and while Grace's cancer remained terminal, her doctors had upgraded her prognosis from weeks to possibly years. "Miracles happen when folks stop trying to die alone," Hope's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had observed when she brought over another casserole. The entire mountain community had rallied around what they'd started calling the Miracle Family: Grace, Hope, and Spirit, bound together by circumstances that defied explanation but felt inevitable once you knew the whole story. Grace had been reluctant to accept help at first, insisting she didn't want to be anyone's burden, but Hope had been equally insistent, pointing out that Sarah would have done the same thing if their positions were reversed. That argument had finally broken through Grace's defenses, and she'd agreed to move into Hope's spare bedroom, just until I get back on my feet. Neither of them mentioned that Grace might never fully get back on her feet. Some conversations were too painful to have directly, so they communicated instead through the quiet language of shared meals, evening conversations on the porch, and the daily rituals of caring for Spirit together. The Bobcat had adapted to their new living arrangement with surprising grace. Hope had expected territorial behavior, dominance struggles, or at least some adjustment period. Instead, Spirit seemed to understand instinctively that Hope was now part of her family unit. She divided her affections equally between the two women, bringing Hope dead mice with the same devotion she'd always shown Grace, and accepting belly rubs and ear scratches from both her humans. "She's teaching us how to love without conditions," Grace observed one evening as they watched Spirit stalk a squirrel in the backyard. "Animals don't hold grudges. They don't punish you for past mistakes. They just love you exactly as you are right now, in this moment." Hope nodded, remembering her own guilt over Sarah's death, the years she'd spent believing she should have somehow prevented the accident that claimed her sister. Cherokee wisdom says that guilt is a poison we drink hoping to punish someone else. But the only person it ever hurts is us. Their conversations had become a form of healing for both women. Grace talked about Tommy for the first time since his death, sharing memories that were joyful rather than tragic. Hope spoke about Sarah, about the sister who'd dreamed of working with wildlife but died before she could pursue that calling. They discovered that Sarah had known Grace through the Wildlife Center's volunteer program, that she'd specifically mentioned Grace as someone Hope should meet someday. "Sarah always said you two would like each other," Grace admitted one afternoon while they watched Spirit teach her 3 cubs to hunt in the backyard. The Bobcat had given birth 6 weeks after their rescue, surprising everyone, including the veterinarian who'd examined her. "She said you both had the same stubborn streak and the same soft heart for broken things." The cubs had been an unexpected blessing, adding new life and energy to their unconventional household. Hope had worried about having baby bobcats so close to neighbors, but the community had embraced them as local celebrities. Children from the nearby elementary school came by every weekend for educational visits, and the local newspaper had run a feature story about the family that proves love has no boundaries. More importantly for Grace, the cubs had given her a new sense of purpose. Working with Dr. Running Bear, she'd developed an educational program about wildlife rehabilitation that brought school groups and scout troops to Hope's property several times a week. Grace would tell them about Spirit's story, about the importance of respecting wild animals while understanding that sometimes the line between wild and domestic was more complicated than people assumed. "Miss Grace," a 7-year-old had asked during last week's visit, "how did you know Spirit loved you?" Grace had been quiet for a long moment before answering. "Love isn't something you know, sweetie. It's something you feel. Spirit showed me love by choosing to stay with me when she could have run away. She showed me love by bringing me presents even when they were dead mice. And she showed me the biggest love of all when she left me to find help, even though leaving me was the hardest thing she'd ever done." Hope had watched Grace's face during that exchange and seen something she hadn't expected. Peace. Not the resignation of someone waiting to die, but the deep contentment of someone who'd found meaning in their remaining time. The community support had been overwhelming in the best possible way. Local contractors had volunteered to build proper enclosures for the Bobcat family, ensuring they had both security and space to roam. The state wildlife department had granted special permits allowing Grace and Hope to keep Spirit and her cubs for educational purposes. Even the Methodist Church had gotten involved, organizing meal trains and fundraising drives to help with medical expenses. "This is what community looks like," Hope told Grace one evening as they counted donation checks from people they'd never met. "This is what happens when folks remember that we're all connected, that helping one person helps everyone." Grace had been particularly moved by the letters that came with many donations, people sharing their own stories of loss, of finding hope in unexpected places, of the animals that had helped them heal. One letter from a widower in California particularly touched her. "Your story reminded me that grief shared is grief halved, and love shared is love multiplied. Thank you for showing us that family can be found in the most surprising places." As autumn painted the Virginia mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Grace's health had stabilized enough for her to start making plans beyond mere survival. She and Hope had applied for grants to establish a permanent wildlife education center on Hope's property, with Spirit and her cubs as the flagship residents. The Cherokee Nation had expressed interest in supporting the project as a way to share traditional knowledge about the relationship between humans and animals. "I never thought I'd live to see Tommy's 6th birthday," Grace admitted as they planned a celebration for what would have been her son's birthday in 2 weeks. Now I'm making plans for Christmas, for next spring, for Spirit's cub's first winter. It's strange how hope creeps back in when you're not paying attention. Hope smiled, watching Spirit demonstrate hunting techniques to her cubs while maintaining constant awareness of where Grace was sitting. Cherokee tradition says that when the Great Spirit calls someone home, it's because their work on earth is finished. Maybe your work wasn't done yet. Maybe my work was just beginning, Grace corrected. Maybe everything that happened, losing Tommy, finding Spirit, almost dying in that ravine, maybe it was all leading to this, to sitting on this porch with you, watching these beautiful creatures, knowing that tomorrow we'll teach more children about the connections between all living things. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Spirit's cubs played in the yard while their mother maintained her evening vigil between Grace and Hope. The scene was so peaceful, so perfect in its imperfection, that Hope felt her grandmother's presence in the cooling air. Sometimes the Great Spirit breaks our hearts to make room for more love, she could almost hear her grandmother saying. Sometimes the family we're meant to have isn't the family we're born into, but the family we choose when we're brave enough to let love lead the way. Thank you, Grace said quietly, and Hope wasn't sure if she was talking to her, to Spirit, or to whatever force had brought them all together. Thank you for what? For showing me that it's possible to start over, even when you think your story is finished. For proving that family isn't just blood, but choice and commitment and showing up for each other every single day. Grace reached over and squeezed Hope's hand. For helping me keep my promise to Tommy. What promise was that? Grace smiled, watching Spirit gently correct one of her cubs who'd gotten too aggressive during play. I promised him I'd take care of Spirit. I just never imagined that taking care of Spirit would mean letting other people take care of me, too. As full darkness settled over the mountains, they moved inside to the warmth of Hope's kitchen, where Spirit would claim her usual spot on the rug between their chairs. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories to share, new connections to forge between the human and animal worlds. But tonight, there was just this. 2 women, 1 bobcat, 3 cubs, and the quiet miracle of a family that had found itself in the most unexpected way imaginable. In the soft lamplight, surrounded by the gentle sounds of contentment, Hope understood that some stories don't have endings. They just keep growing, adding new chapters, creating new possibilities for love to flourish in places where logic says it shouldn't be possible. Life is but a dream, Hope found herself humming, the words of Tommy's favorite song carrying new meaning in the gathering darkness. And sometimes, she thought, the most beautiful dreams are the ones that come true when you're brave enough to believe in love that transcends species, circumstances, and even death itself. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, it's because we all understand something profound about love, loss, and the unexpected ways life brings us exactly what we need when we need it most. Grace. Morning Star thought her story was over when she lost her precious Tommy, but the good Lord had other plans. Sometimes our greatest heartaches prepare us for our greatest blessings. Hope Whitehawk learned that family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it's about showing up for someone when they can't show up for themselves. And little Spirit? Well, she proved that love speaks a universal language that crosses every boundary we think exists between species, between strangers, between broken hearts that are ready to heal. As we navigate our golden years, many of us have faced losses that seemed insurmountable, dreams that felt impossible, moments when we wondered if our best days were behind us. But Grace's journey reminds us that it's never too late for a new beginning, never too late to find purpose, and never too late to discover that the family we choose can be just as powerful as the family we're born into. What unexpected blessing has life brought you when you thought all hope was lost? Have you ever experienced an animal's love that helped heal your heart? Please share your stories in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.